session. Thank you. We're aiming to just kind of bring all that together somewhat and kind of garner the opinions from our esteemed panel here. The things we've covered, of course, churches and clinics, safety and danger, money versus meaning, alternative futures, and some of the key words that have jumped out for me, which I invite my panelists to kind of pick up on if they want, things like ethical capitalism, issues around legislation, decriminalisation versus medicalisation, shared use and relationship, access and inclusivity, salutogenesis, I love that word, and the juxtaposition between the shamanic and the scientific as well. So I'm going to let my wonderful panelists introduce themselves and just pick up on the idea of what unifying means to them within this context. Merlin.
Thanks, Dave. It's wonderful to be here. And I'll avoid tackling this question head on. But when I hear the word unifying, and I think of the ways that unification represents problems for us in our inquiries as humans, and problems with that may be ill-posed problems, I think of our experience. I think of our conscious experience, which somehow arises in a way that normally feels fairly unitary and unified, arising out of numberless physiological sensory processes in our bodies. Numberless chemical reactions, numberless relationships with organisms and entities outside of us. And somehow this can all come together into a unified experience, which, if things are working in a healthy way, can allow us to guide our path through life. So I often think about a line from the French philosopher Bergson, who said, when he was talking about religion, he said, most religions start from the molten lava of mystical experience, direct contact with the divine, direct contact with that which is more than us. And that molten lava over time hardens and solidifies into the cool, hard rock of doctrine and dogma. And so are there ways that we can encourage ourselves to go back upstream to these molten lava places, to these places of direct encounter, direct experience, and drink from those waters and dip our hands in that molten lava, and avoid always being rigid and doctrine and dogma, because we all need that balance of chaos and stability in our thinking, our waking lives, and in all the ways that we interact with the world. So I'm so excited by some recent developments in the psychedelic space where I'm seeing religious leaders from different faiths coming to psychedelics as a way to bring back some mystery, bring back some molten lava into what for many has become a hardened rock of doctrine and dogma, and has excluded so many people from access to these very old spiritual traditions which have so much knowledge and can help us in so many ways. So this idea of psychedelics coming back into congregational, ritual, theological contexts, coming back perhaps again, and helping people to connect with these big traditions that carry us forward, whether or not we consider ourselves a religious person or a believer. So this is one way that I'm excited to see things move, and it's one way which I think unification comes to mind, because in these experiences of these mystical experiences, these experiences of contact with that which is more than us, I think there's a unification that happens there, a kind of effortless unification. It reminds us that this is possible, and that we live in a unifying state for much of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Merlin, thank you very much. Could you actually introduce yourself a little bit, though, please?
Sorry. My name is Merlin. I'm a psychologist and a writer, and I don't work in the psychedelic space officially. I'm the kind of the ringer on the panel, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Maria.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Really nice to see the energy that's around gathering together and coming together because of our shared passion for this work and these spaces. So I'm Maria. I work as a psychotherapist in Brighton, working a lot with psychedelic integration. And with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Tim Reid, we have co-founded the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy. And we are trying to support the process of developing safe and skillful frameworks for using these substances for therapeutic and healing purposes. And as a therapist, the word unification for me touches on the word integration, which is very, very dear to what we do in IPT. And to integrate is to really enter a process of unfolding. We have to step into the unknown and allow things to emerge and have a readiness to witness what emerges and find a way to bring it into relationship with what was already there. I think relationship is at the heart of this, and Merlin has already noted that word. When we think about integration in therapeutic terms, you know, the hidden spaces that are in the unconscious rise up to meet what's mostly seen and known, the conscious. And we have to really support a relationship between the two. We have to get to know ourselves a little bit better, a little bit deeper, a little bit more intimately. These journeys of integration seem like they are in service to our own wholeness, but nothing exists in isolation. Of course, if we move into greater wholeness, then that really expands into everything that's around us. Every such process is an offering to the collective. Ultimately, that's really what this work is about. And it's going to be quite difficult to bring the wider dialogues together. There's going to be challenges. We're going to have to hold the tension of the opposites enough and be able to bear it and survive it until new answers and solutions come forth from all of us collectively. There are no simple answers, clear maps, easy ways forward. I think we're going to have to grapple with complexity and the unknown, and I think in some cases we're going to make headways, and in some cases we're going to have some very difficult lessons to learn. We're going to have to do a lot of unlearning. That's very difficult for a lot of us. Learning is easier than letting go of things that are already established in us. In integration, that's usually the hardest thing. How do you accommodate something that has risen from the depths that actually really contradicts who you thought you were? And I think we're going to have to sit with ourselves honestly as well. It's very easy to project things on the outside and see everything that's happening that's wrong or perhaps out of sync with ethics, somewhere out there in some capitalist structure or in some organization that we think has done wrong. And I think that can be the case. But we have to sit with ourselves and say, you know, how do we contribute to what is happening? How are we making use of our place in the psychedelic spaces? How much do we profit from it? How much do we support the mainstreaming that inevitably gets to a place where we have to grapple with enormous complexity? So sitting with ourselves authentically, the relational field and integration is what comes up for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much, Maria. Amanda, you've already kind of introduced yourself because you're doing a double bit, but you can say a few words more about that before talk to
Well, my name's Amanda, as you said. And what was the
Unifying.
theme? Unifying.
Unifying.
Yeah. Well, on two levels of unification. One is that since I started this battle in 1966, where I considered the enemy was the taboo against the advantages of expanding, enhancing our consciousness. To me, it's so obvious it's an advantage to enhance one's consciousness. One hardly need say it or make it legal because it's so obvious. But it's taken 60 years to get almost nowhere in the regulatory framework. But luckily, in the scientific proof of concept, I think we've got quite a long way. And I would personally like to celebrate for myself the fact that now I'm just setting up a program of studies with 6 studies in them. 3 are to do with full-dose LSD and 3 to do with microdosing. And the full-dosing ones, one is to explore the mystical experience deeper than it's ever been done before with the latest brain imaging technology, which is something called MRI 7 Tesla. So you get much deeper and clearer. And we're going to use that in a personalized, individual attempt to make a portrait of what is a mystical experience from the person's experience, and then what is happening on the interior cerebral circulation, neuronal behavior, all of that, have everything mapped. And so we can make a map which is further ahead than we've yet made it on the mystical experience. And what is beautiful is the mystical experience has come to wave a flag because it's at the very center of healing. And so, having been put to sleep by the scientific world, now they'll have to start to respect it again. And other parts of this research I'm doing is to investigate and hopefully demonstrate the reality of it, which is that ever since the 60s I learned from a Dutch scientist actually about how the hypothesis of the underlying mechanism is an increase of blood to the brain capillaries, so that we've suddenly got immense boost in energy. And that seems to be why psychedelics are so wonderful. We've suddenly got more energy to direct wherever we want, at whatever level. We can microdose or we can full dose. And all the different levels have different effects. And that is what I think is so amazingly valuable about psychedelics, is they're non-specific. Actually, at the moment, I'm working with Alzheimer's, with microdosing LSD, to bring back the lost sense of self, to bring people out of vegetative space into cognitive sharpness. And for that aim, I'm doing research in Basel, a clinical trial, but also I'm planning setting up a new type of care home where people will be given, or if they want, microdoses of psychedelics together with doulas who are trained in psychedelic-assisted therapy. So they'll entertain the people in the care home, and then we'll get data from the whole process. And then another of the research things is looking into changes in blood supply. So it's very exciting. I think things are opening up amazingly. I think I think psychedelics are now deeply rooted into society beyond the point when they can probably be turned back. And so a lot has been achieved, and hopefully a lot more will happen rather quickly now. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, you've got your own. And over to Robin.
Well, good evening, would you say? Or afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the PC crew for having me back. I've been back in the UK for about 3 days now. Formerly, I was at Imperial College London, directing a program of research there in psychedelic science, and then was given an amazing opportunity to go over to University of California, San Francisco, where I've been since September last year. And it's a lot of fun, but very pleased to be back. So that's me, I'm Robin. I always try to be mindful to thank Amanda for giving me my start back in Bristol during my PhD, and then my postdoc. Amanda and the Beckley Foundation really made made it possible for me to come into this area. So endless gratitude to Amanda. And I was touched by some things that Maria was saying about tension. Of course, you know, there's tension before you sit on a stage and talk to people, and so that seems to resonate. I saw, you know, this event called Worlds Collide, and I thought, oh, I don't really like Worlds Colliding. But then I noticed I was on a unifying panel. It's much more my cup of tea. But as the Englishman in me. But the sitting with tension is probably at the heart of trying to unify a space that has tension. You know, I'm mindful. I think it's quite interesting to explore what happens in a situation of tension or a situation of uncertainty, and what we can easily do to try and sort of suspend that uncomfortable state, you know, whether it's, say, projecting onto the other, say the opposite, to, in a sense, make a point or reinforce your own position. Very easy to do. It goes very closely alongside a splitting, you know, simplifying things into kind of black and white, you know, good and bad. That perhaps doesn't really reflect the complexity of the reality. Now, I remember a couple of episodes that might be just curious to mention way back when, not that far back, but anyway, a colleague of mine, called Neelafar Family, we were watching, I think, David Nutt on a news interview, Al Jazeera, and then she made this point about, oh, you realize psychedelics are going to be commercialized, don't you? And then she described this dystopic, you know, development and all these tensions. And as I often do, I was quite dismissive. I thought, that's not going to happen. It's all going to be, you know, plain sailing, and we're going to sort of, you know, move this space into the limelight and so on. And anyway, she said that. And then the other event was Chris Timmerman, another, you know, dear colleague of mine, said in relation to the burgeoning space of psychedelic science and medicine, it's complexifying. And while he was saying that, he was saying, and it's bringing in debate. And I think there's something interesting there, whereas, you know, I was reflecting, sat with Ben Sessa earlier at the back of the audience, how we were together in, I think, 2006, that first Basel event, Amanda, for Albert Hoffman. And it was so simple, you know. Everyone was, yay, psychedelics, and there's so much stigma, and they're underappreciated as scientific tools and potential therapeutic agents. And we were sort of, you know, just sort of paddling to catch a wave. But with the complexity becomes more voices, more interest, and more tension. And into that tension, people can do what they do when they don't like tension. I don't like tension, I hate it. And you can make mistakes, you know. You can be, perhaps lack a patience, perhaps lack a space in your mind for the complexity and for disagreement. So, you know, unifying a complex space ain't going to be easy, and it's probably going to get a bit harder, I don't know. But I'm on the cusp of rambling, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. On the cusp of rambling, I like that. So one of the things that kind of came up here, and this is quite organic, is the idea of the mystical, which some of you touched upon, or kind of the idea of, you know, religious use of psychedelics and bringing it to religious doctrines. And I know your father was a big fan of the idea of cannabis in cathedrals. I wonder if we might also have psilocybin in cathedrals, and maybe even 5-MeO in cathedrals, I don't know. But the idea of the mystical then, and where that sits, it seems to be that we've come to a point in time whereby, up until recently, perhaps the idea of the mystical was either pathologized or demonized. You know, it was considered to be something abhorrent or that way madness lies. And now we've almost come to the point where it's turned 180, and the work that you mentioned, Amanda, how we find these very strong relationships between the intensity of the mystical experience and better clinical outcomes in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And of course, we have this fantastic neuroimaging work that's going on to try and map what's going on in the brain. But I think as Merlin really nicely kind of pointed out in his book, there's this disjuncture or kind of an oddness or an uneasy fit of having the experience and then having the scientific approach to it and perhaps trying to answer weird questions whilst you're very high on LSD about how ineffable and how mystical your experience is. And just the approach of science, and how does the approach of science come to the mystical? What is this kind of disparity between these two, and how can we come about and try and unify the world of the scientific with the spiritual, which are effectively very different engines? So I'm going to throw that open for discussion. How do we bring together the scientific and the spiritual?
Yeah, I think they're rather beautiful to marry.
Do you want to have a go?
Well, I think it's wonderful. I love the mystical experience. As a child, that was my big kick, because I was very isolated, and the mystical experience was like a treat. And now it's very exciting to feel that one can explore it deeper than one ever. Obviously, one won't understand it, but one can understand more of its underpinnings, which in turn makes one understand it better. And it makes one understand consciousness, which is obviously the most fascinating subject, better. And I feel that to expand our understanding of ourselves, like the old Delphi saying, know thyself, is the best step forward for humanity. Because what obviously the higher state is, which is caused by psychedelic and the mystical experience, is it's the highest state of neuroplasticity. You have the most opportunity to relearn and set your compass in a better way. And I think we need to bring back that center. I think humanity's got rather lost without the center of the spiritual, the mystical, the something beyond making money and seeing the reflection in the mirror. And I think myself is that the psychedelics, what they're doing is giving the brain, the self, more energy. And that's lovely. It's making one more childlike again, more open, more connectivity, basically. And I think that's very exciting for us to move forward with that.
Thank you, Amanda.
It's fun to chat about this with David, because he was one of the scientists overseeing the study that I was part of, which was scientists looking at scientists on LSD. And it's not usual that scientists get to be the subjects of their experiments by the scientists, but I think it should be compulsory education for all, as part of all science degrees, because you really start to see things from a different point of view. And but it was hilarious. I think some of the times I've laughed most in my life was when I was high on the acid and being asked to answer once again. I had to keep answering these questionnaires. The mystical experience questionnaire. I was like, oh, he's back again. And then an hour later, I was like, I've already done this. And then back to the question, which always destroyed me. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate your experience of infinity? I had to try and answer that question 5 times. Leaving it blank wasn't an option. Nor could I write comments in the margin. They needed a number, because it's science, and science deals in quantities, in what you can measure. And this is this is really a powerful education experience for me, because it comes to the core of this matter, which is that the sciences are founded, at least the science being the sciences, and the sciences being a diverse collection of values and practices and beliefs, expectations and skills, all with different histories and manners. But what we call the sciences today, at least the main dominant paradigm of science, emerges from a bifurcation of the world into primary quantities and secondary qualities. Importantly, quantities are primary. This was Galileo. And that's what science would deal with quantities, because that's what we can measure. And so all of the qualities, which of course are many of the most important things in our lives and in the other lives unfolding around us, were bracketed aside because they were unmeasurable. So when we're trying to deal with mystical experience from a scientific point of view, this modern scientific point of view, of course we run into trouble. We run into the same kind of problems that we do when we try and study consciousness, hence the hard problem of consciousness. Because modern sciences evolved to deal precisely not with this question. And so when they come back to try and deal with this question, there's a kind of dissonance, a confusion, and it's rooted in a very deliberate moment in history. So I think one way forward is to start to deepen and expand what we think of as the sciences, and to remember that there are lots of ways of knowing and observing, lots of ways of coming to understanding that we might find can flow in and enrich the sciences as we know them today, so we can step into a larger room where we still have the sciences we know today, but there might be other kinds of science that we can bring there too, which might have an easier time grappling with the mystical experience.
The mystical is about the mystery, and the mystery requires surrendering, and science is about keeping hold and control of things and mapping out. So we're in another tension of the opposites that we have to find a way to hold through. It's not an easy process. And I like the absurdity that you bring through when we try to bring the two together when they're not ready to. And there is a question in some spaces: is there a possibility for integration, or do these things need to be separate and respectful of each other, with a clear understanding of the place, purpose, and limitations of each? In systemic theory, we have this idea that when you have a system, whatever gets excluded from the system tries to come through in other ways. And I have this kind of sequence in my mind, which is not based on fact. It's just a kind of way, a framework of understanding perhaps what has happened, in nowhere scientific. We have the early times where we have quite primitive belief systems, where nature is around us. There's a lot of, how do you call it when you're afraid of a black cat? Superstition.
It's a black hat.
I love black cat. There's superstition, there's a lot of anxiety about the world around us, but there's also a lot of reverence and ritual. You have that superseded by religion, and religion came to replace that territory, if you like, and religion tried to separate themselves from superstition. They considered themselves to be truth, dogma. They didn't really incorporate their ancestor. So they ended up, without realizing, having the ancestor incorporated into what they're saying, trying so much to get away from it. And then that gets superseded by religion, by science. And science, of course, understandably, tries to separate itself from its ancestor, ×2 now. But by doing that, it ends up assimilating some of the dogmatic elements sometimes, or the rigid elements that in the first place needed to find a way to enter the system in a way that had dialogue, understanding, continuity. So whatever we try to keep out, in a way, will make its way back into what we're trying to do. And again, we land in complexity, not easy answers, but an understanding that everything is present anyway at any given moment. We talk about these things as separate, but they have their own, it's not about us bringing them together, they have their own way of coalescing anyway into each other.
Thank you, Maria.
Well,
So the tension between science and spirituality is a tension I quite enjoy, because as a scientist, I do see it as an opportunity. You know, some of the merits of science are its kind of humility to test its ideas, to put them to the test. Really, that's an essential aspect of science. And then another one is that to do that well, you do it in a disciplined way. And so, for example, you have to define the variables that you're testing and sometimes control them, sometimes kind of let them breathe in a sort of naturalistic study. Often there's, you know, just as much exploration in science as there is kind of, you know, exploitation or drilling down into something. And I think that needs to be appreciated, like a, you know, child with wide-eyed wonder looking at the world with pure uncertainty and then mopping it up as they go on and starting to, you know, complexify their model of the world that they inhabit. But it begins with that open exploration, and when that starts to harden, you can be in trouble. So that's, in a sense, a word to science and its merits. However, the scientific approach and scientific thinking is of the analytical mind. It's not something that you can do so well when you're tripping. And in fact, as we've just heard, there's an absurdity to it, you know, mystical type experience, ego dissolution. What the hell is that, you know? And then to measure it. So there is that. So in a sense, again, coming back to perhaps tensions around unification, just like there's a tension between, you know, dualism versus materialism, where I think after a long while you can begin to think that there is a natural dualism there, that they are in a sense different things. We can use the scientific method to potentially begin to demystify some aspects of, say, the mystical experience or spiritual experience, and I think there's a value in that. And I don't think people necessarily need to be frightened by that, but I understand that they could be. But I see it as an opportunity and potentially a good one, you know, through which there can be a process of unification and integration. You know, scientists coming into a space and being able to understand something better that previously was alien to them or they felt was somehow other. So, yeah, those would be my 2 cents.
Sense now. Fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Okay. That's rambling. I don't know.
I'm just going to open this up for just kind of more generic discussion, and we'll kind of treat it like imagine the table's on fire. No, don't get up and run away. Like a fireside chat, and you know, my points on that. The table's not on fire, unless, yeah. Anyway, so but about demystifying. There's nothing wrong, certainly, with demystifying the experience and trying to understand it and what's going on in the brain and all the rest of it. And yet, there is always some mystery. You know, I think we have to accept that. Ultimately, the life is a mystery. Our existence is a mystery. Being is a mystery, and there's many things we cannot understand and cannot know. And like sitting with that, as Maria said, you know, this kind of uncertainty and complexity, and I think that has to be a part of it. But I like your point about bringing in different ways of doing science, and what might that look like? You know, what can we gather from this exploration into the mystical through psychedelics in a scientific framework? You know, Charles talked about having state-specific sciences, that you do science from inside different states of consciousness. It didn't really take on. He got it published in Science back in the 70s, and there's never anyone ever kind of picked up on that theme. But I would say your experience in these experiments is kind of trying to do state-specific science of taking scientists and giving them LSD to work on their technical problems is a kind of state-specific science. And I guess we're going to hear a bit more about that experience after this session. But yeah, just kind of throwing that out there if anybody wants to pick up on any of those threads.
I love what Albert Hoffman once said, which is a scientist who's not a mystic is no scientist, meaning he's a technician, I think. You know, and he was a perfect example of a scientist who was a mystic. And well, I think he's a wonderful man, and he was the happiest man I ever met, I think because he knew what an incredible gift he'd given to humanity. And whatever they said about his troublesome child, he knew it was a winner, and, you know, humanity should be very grateful for it, I think. And I promised I'd realign it in society before his 100th birthday, but I desperately failed, but I think we'll realign it, you know, before too long, I hope.
I think there are so many ways that the questions we ask, the inquiries we make, come from quite an undifferentiated position of play and of childlike curiosity. And if I was reading Michael Faraday's experimental researches, and I don't know if anyone's read these, but if you haven't, then I really do advise you do. He was a brilliant scientist. Many of you have heard of him, did many, many things. But in his experimental researches, it's just a lot of his, like write-ups of his experiments, just all in one book. You can get it online. It's open access. And you just read through this, it's one after the other. It's like, on the ability to hold one's breath underwater for a very long time. And then he says, well, he was down in the pub, and there was somebody there who had been hanging out with Polynesian pearl divers, and they were an expert at holding their breath, and they'd gone down with Brunel when the Thames Tunnel started to leak, and a diving bell, and there was this whole wonderful story. And then he reflected on what this told us about the nature of gas exchange in the lungs, because if you're under the water and the pressure is like this, and this would do this, and then you move on. And then the next one's about the vibrations of water in containers and dishes, Faraday waves. And you keep reading through this stuff, and you see this like a wonderful overgrown child in his lab with all of these things around him. You know, the same props feature again and again, like the bit of bent card, the bit of glass. This cast of characters seems to remain the same no matter what question he's addressing. But you see it coming from this place of play. And I feel like a lot of modern scientific education is not coming from a place of play. And I feel like all sorts of problems would resolve quite easily if we could pull science back into a playful place and pull scientific education back into a playful place and value that as a source of connection and imagination.
Anyone else like to comment on that?
Only, you know, I think, who was it, Feynman, Richard Feynman. Oh, I'm sorry. Richard Feynman said something to the same point. Like, I guess the constraining forces that can come in upon a scientist, you know, trying to survive, can be so tragic. You know, say funding. This is one of the great merits of philanthropic funding for psychedelic science. It can feed that kind of playful question asking, whereas industry funding can't do that so well. They have much more of a focus and a limited budget on a particular goal, usually licensing, and then you have the mainstream scientific funding bodies who are very conservative, very risk averse, and they'll basically end up seeing things, you know, supported that really aren't very explorative at all, and that's a real shame. So I just wanted to speak to some of the harsh realities that can impinge on that ideal of the explorative scientist.
I just feel I quite agree with you, and I think that's where philanthropic funding is of such enormous benefit, because those inspired people who are willing to give it enable one to explore things which have no financial aim. They're just for human, increasing our understanding. And I think we need to keep that open as it gets more and more financially dominated, the psychedelic world. We need to keep the play, the interest, the self-discovery aspects of it open. And I think we need philanthropic funding, hopefully, to supply that.
Thank you, Amanda. Anyone else for comment? Maria? I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll open this up to some questions from the audience. We've got about 20 minutes left, which can be as broad and wide-ranging as you like.
I was wondering, in all the complexities that come with, I don't know, make someone trip on LSD or psilocybin and then scanning their brain, because no two brains are going to be exactly identical. It's going to come up with probably different results every time. I was wondering, is that going to be a sort of something that fuels the research further into the future, because of that sort of curiosity around, hey, nothing's ever going to be exactly the same, right? Or is it going to be a drawback, as people, I suppose, at least perhaps some of the funders might lose patience in not getting always the same results that they might like, or consistent results?
Brilliant.
The fact that I guess results are unpredictable is, first of all, it's just a reflection on reality. That you know, things are variable and complex, but it can be an opportunity to ask further questions. You know, why is there difference here? How can we explain that difference? I mean, group averaging will give you a group average, but then you lose information in that. In fact, there might be some merit in looking at the extreme cases, both in terms of, you know, in the clinical domain, say extreme positive and negative responses to psychedelics, but also extreme individual differences in terms of changes in brain function. So that's a major opportunity, again, rather than it be a problem, it's really an opportunity. And there I think we do need a bit of patience. I mean, I remember when I first came into brain imaging, not understanding it, I thought you turn this machine on, push a button, and you get a readout, and it's the answer, how LSD or psilocybin works in the brain, and how wrong I was. You know, it's just the beginning of, I guess, feeling your way into this dark room and finding something, and then, oh, what's this? And really the quest goes on. And the reason being that the problem is very complex, but I think there lies the opportunity, and we probably need to be patient before we get our big hitting solutions, which will come slowly. Rambling. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting, like in this new study we're doing to look at the mystical experience. But we're doing it as an individual, personalized study on each person at a deeper level than before. One will learn more about which parts of the brain are active when a person has a mystical experience. Is it the same as when you have high intuition, or when telepathy, or, you know, you'll learn a little bit more about what the human brain and how it works. Each hopeful step, we learn a little more, and that's rather fascinating, I think.
Yes, thank you. Another question?
Hi, I'm a trainee child psychiatrist, I'm a systemic therapist, and I had a question about inclusivity within the clinical and research realm. Medicine and psychology are very elitist professions, and it seems to me the research within psychedelics is often led by white people with white participants. Therefore, I think the meaning that's made out of the experiences are within that frame, ending up with things that perhaps don't make sense or don't connect with communities that are marginalised. And these are communities that are already excluded and let down by mainstream psychiatry and psychology. So how do we make psychedelic treatment accessible and meaningful for these marginalised communities?
Thank you. Anybody?
I can start. No answers, but yeah, thank you for raising it. You're absolutely right. There's an enormous issue around diversity, and I like what Gabriel said in the earlier panel, really asking communities what is it that's needed here, and what is it that needs to be on offer. With my colleague Tim, we were writing a book, and we were thinking about what it means to be a perhaps a minority patient doing psychedelic psychotherapy with 2 white guides and sitters. And the question we had is, can we really face the pain together, or are we just kidding ourselves? And there's a further issue. You know, if we look at current NHS treatments and guidelines, they usually have budget restrictions and constrictions, and that means that what they have on offer for most mental health issues, if we are to be realistic, they're really inadequate for helping to heal the wounds that people come with. And I would expect the same will happen with psychedelic medicine. We're going to see NHS provisions that are going to be quite inadequate because of budget restrictions. So we're going to need a layer outside that, a ring of private practitioners that can get nearer to where the real work is. But that's going to need real fundraising, psychedelic philanthropy, organizations that really support those that have. What happens is that those with the most need have the least resources. So how do we bridge that enormous gap that's just widening? No answers, but a question we need to be moving with constantly, especially as things open up, because if we can't do it for where there are the parts of society that hold the biggest wounding, then we won't heal, all of us.
Yeah, thank you. More questions?
Robin?
Just to say a bit more on it, because again, another interesting tension point. You know, I think, efforts in the direction of a solution are going to have to be proactive, because certainly the researchers don't intend to have, a white dominant team, for example, and 90% white patients. Just as breaking conventional, this event didn't plan for there to be an audience that, is majority white, it seems, and isn't entirely consistent, say, with the demographics of London. So why do these things happen, and what could be done to promote a sense of openness and inclusivity, open doors? And I think I suppose a number of concrete solutions could be suggested, scholarships, but they're not easy solutions, are they? But I just wanted to pick up the mic because it's an easy one to let go. It's one of those that we will sort of hear as a problem, but never really sort of rest on for a while. So just be aware that we're aware of it and are trying to think about how to improve it.
Great, thank you, Robert. Other questions? Yeah, okay.
I completely get the idea that a psychedelic experience for a scientist could actually be a wonderfully insightful thing and could do good. But where I struggle with is this: what important and interesting question about the psychedelic experience could science ever give an answer to?
Oh, that's a great one. You turn to me. Oh gosh, let me think about it.
What answers could science ever give to the psychedelic experience? Anybody like to take that one?
What answers, firm answers?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think you could learn more about consciousness, and that, in a way, is the most fascinating subject, as humanity's made its position by expanding its consciousness, and the more we can expand it and kind of, to a certain degree, control that expansion, the better is our chances of survival. And I think that's a very exciting aim, to understand how we work better. And the mystical experience is kind of catching the mystical in a kind of rather mundane way, but it can tie down certain points, so we begin to understand it better, I feel. And I think that's very exciting.
Well, just briefly, I guess, I don't know who said this, but, some of the things that science can contribute are explanation, prediction, and then what's the other one? Manipulation or control, oh God. But I guess that's what, science promises. Great. But then you start to realize concrete problems like, how do you better predict a psychedelic experience? How do you better understand what's happening when someone's having a particular psychedelic experience? They understand what's going on in their body, including their brain, but in their body. And actually, if we're measuring peripherally, that might actually be more useful in terms of application, knowing where someone is. There's so much. In a sense, it's sort of endless. Of course, it doesn't give final solutions because perhaps, final solutions don't exist. But I do feel like the quest is one of iterative discovery and realization. I do feel it's going somewhere, but maybe I'm deluding myself.
Personally, I feel like the most interesting things about psychedelic experiences are the experiences themselves. And as I mentioned, modern, what you might call reductive physicalism, the main paradigm of modern science, excludes itself from interiority because it positions itself as that which looks objectively from the outside. So it's very hard to do that to the inside. There's this tension, and as I mentioned, this hard problem of consciousness is a perfect expression of this tension, this wrinkle. And so I agree that I think the most exciting things about psychedelic experiences are going to be the interiority, and I think that is something which that is hard for at least modern practicing scientists today to reach. Not that it's impossible for a deepened and expanded kind of scientific practice to reach, but just today that's a little tricky. But I think there are plenty of useful questions, like the ways that the toxicity of LSD in the blood, how long these substances last in the bloodstream, the brain scanning, which I feel are more descriptions of the psychedelic states than explanations, because for me, people have experiences, not brains. And so I think those are very, very valuable parts of this ways of coming to know the psychedelic experiences from other sides. Then you can have the natural history of these phenomena. You can talk with populations, surveys of people's experiences. You can see how in whole populations these views converge or diverge. I think there are lots of scientific tools that can be helpful, but I do agree with you that the most interesting thing remains a little out of reach.
Thank you, Merlin. Time for one last question.
I have a microphone.
Yeah.
I don't want. Hello, my name is David. I work in McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, and Terence's name has been brought up here a couple of times with different quotes. So here, I have a lot of light now. So I just thought about this idea of unifying in this field, and I kind of came up based on how Terence could describe these experiences and how could make them relatable for the bigger crowd. I wanted to ask, what if we could bring the art of philosophy into science in general and try to use that as a way of unifying it with the spirituality and the science in a way that's really relatable to a bigger amount of people? Because in the end, the science and the numbers and scalability and all these things are kind of not relatable to people, the majority of people, maybe besides the white scientific nerdy crowd that we are. Dennis recently said something really special. We are all indigenous to this planet, and that really stuck with me, and I like how people can really put it in words. So the question is, what do you think about philosophy and this field of science? Thank you.
What do we think about philosophy?
I think that's a great question. I think some of the most exciting studies on psychedelics that I'm seeing right now are coming from philosophers who are using these states of experience to start to tackle very big questions, metaphysical questions about the nature of reality and the nature of being. and to start to bring in some philosophical thinkers who might have been marginalized or left outside, and in different wisdom traditions and traditional knowledge systems, and starting to really work with the ideas point of it. So I feel this is a really exciting moment for that right now, psychedelic philosophy or philosophical psychedelics.
And I feel I absolutely agree with what you say, but I think the aim, the unifying aim in a sense, is for the psychedelic experience of expanded awareness, connectivity, unity, to become more publicly and generally shared. That it's not a kind of medical cure for this or that or that. It's that too, but that is not only that. The most beautiful manifestation of it, I think, is when the general consciousness of people is more used to having those altered states. And I think our society will be enhanced when it's, part of our natural life to experience these altered states, which is slightly looser, more flexible, more loving, more compassionate. We've shown that in the research. These rather high-level human characteristics are encouraged through altered states of consciousness. So when it becomes a more normal thing, community centres where inner city children can go and experience psychedelics, maybe the whole thing gets slightly looser.
Thank you, Amanda. Just to say, on the topic of philosophy and psychedelics, you just missed out on a whole conference last week on that. But I think the idea of including ontology, which is the kind of from metaphysics, and the idea of what is the nature of reality, I think psychedelics pose some super interesting questions for that kind of discussion, and that we should also be including other philosophies and other ontologies, other worldviews, that of indigenous people, and where do they sit, where do their cosmologies sit within our discussion about the nature of the psychedelic experience. And that kind of wraps this up nicely, and I think because it leads into a little bit of what's going to come next, which is that Merlin is going to give us a talk specifically, but I'm going to just finish by saying thank you for my brilliant guests, Maria, Amanda, Robin, Merlin. Thank you very much.